Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3. Thankful to be in the service again tonight. We're glad to see each one that's here. If you're visiting with us tonight, thank you for coming to the service. We appreciate you being here with us. Mark chapter 3 is where we're going to read from. We'll be reading the last few verses of that chapter beginning in verse 31. Mark chapter 3, verse 31. We're going to continue with our study of the person, if you will, the person or character of God, who God is, things about God. Again, that's kind of the idea of systematic theology, although that don't sound very appetizing, but it is a wonderful study, knowing who God is, and wonderful things come from knowing God. In fact, the whole Christian life can be summed up in knowing God. And tonight we're going to look at something a little bit different. I believe last time we looked at God's sovereignty and how God is in complete control of everything that's going on, of everything in the world. God has maintained complete control the entire time. Nothing's ever gotten out of hand. Nothing ever has gotten to the place where it's more than He can control, but it is in control completely. And that's a wonderful thing to know. It's a blessing to know that when times seem chaotic to us and when times seem to be more than we can handle, they are not bigger than God. They are not out of control for Him, but He has them all in His hand, and He can stop them if He so sees fit and chooses to at any point that He sees fit. Tonight we're going to look at something a little bit different about God. We're going to look at God's will. God's will. So let's read beginning in verse 31. There came then his brethren and his mother. This is speaking about Jesus. What did I say? John? I say Mark 3:31. Is that right? Is that what I said? Okay. Mark 3 verse 31. Here it's speaking about Jesus. There came then his brethren and his mother, and standing without, sent unto him, calling him. And the multitudes sat about him, and they said unto him, Behold, thy mother and thy brethren without seek for thee. And he answered them, saying, Who is my mother or my brethren? And he looked around about them which sat about him, and said, Behold, my mother and my brethren. For whosoever shall do the will of God, the same is my brother and my sister and mother. I'm going to stop reading there again at the end of the chapter. Jesus here is obviously he's making a statement that is not degrading his parents. It's not degrading those that are blood kin to him. He's not putting them down. What he's saying is that those that do the will of God, which are ultimately those who first trust the Lord Jesus Christ, who are saved, those who have humbled themselves before God and submitted to God through Jesus Christ, he says that these that do the will of God, along with the rest of the will of God, and that as well, what he's saying here is those relationships that he has, spiritually speaking, are of greater and more importance and are closer than those that are blood relation. And so he's saying, Behold, my brethren, behold those that I'm kin to. This is my work. And then he alludes to the fact of the will of God. Those that do the will of God, those are the ones that are my... I mean, you go back to the book of James. I love to read just the introduction of James. James don't beat around the bush. James is right to the point. And he says, James, the servant of Jesus Christ. That's his introduction of himself. James, the servant of Jesus Christ. The reason that so kind of stands out to me is James could have took a moment to brag a little bit. James, the brother of Jesus. Do you know he was blood brothers to Christ? I mean, how cool would that have been, right? And he could have bragged about that a little bit. James, the brother of Jesus, born to Mary and Joseph, and all of this about who he was. But he just says, James, the servant of Jesus Christ. What was more important to James was his spiritual relationship to Jesus rather than his physical relationship to Jesus. Have you ever heard the old saying, blood's thicker than water? I don't know where that came from. I have no idea, and I may be completely wrong. But the first thing that comes in my mind when I hear that is I think about a spiritual relationship. The water as being the idea of baptism. That blood is what's thicker at church. It should be the case that our spiritual relationships mean more and are more to us than and carry more weight than those that are even blood kin to us. That's not to overlook one and put another one down. That's not, but it's the way of Christ. It's saying that the spiritual things of life are more important and are more weighty than those just the physical things that are around us. And so what Jesus is saying is that there is, first off, God has a will. Let me say this. I've told y'all this a bunch of times, but I'm going to say it one more time because repetition is the best way to learn. Remember the crazy professor that said either there is a God or there is not? And both are terrifying. Because if there is not a God, then we're hurling through space at 66,000 miles an hour and nobody's in control. That's terrifying, and it's not true, in fact. But there is a God, and he's in complete control. And this is what he says. He says, if there is control, there is a God. And the reason it's terrifying is because he's in complete control. And we better find out who he is and what he wants. Because he's God. He's God. And so there is a will. And all a will is the desire of God. It's what God desires to see take place. It's what God desires to see happen. And God has a will. And you can look at this will of God in many different aspects. For tonight, the purpose of tonight, we're going to look at it too, and I think that's the best way to divide it. According to will, there's two aspects or two parts of the will of God. But we could ask questions about the will of God okay, what's God's will concerning me in my life? And God has a will concerning me and concerning my life. They say, well, what's God's will concerning the church? There are some things that are general that you can find by the Word of God. And there are some things that are a bit more specific that we have to follow the direction of Christ as he leads us by the Spirit of God. That's like calling a pastor. The Bible doesn't tell you the next pastor to call. You are to pray, you are to seek the Lord, and come together unified in the Spirit of God to know the will of God. But when we look at it generally speaking, what's our job? What are we supposed to be doing? And the Bible answers many of the questions about that. So we could talk about the will of God concerning the church. We could talk about the will of God concerning Israel, the will of God concerning our nation, the world, our family, sin, all of it. And so there's many different ways and many different aspects which we can discuss the will of God. But tonight we're going to look at it in two different ways because I think this is the best way to describe it. It's the way it's made more sense, as much sense to me. And that is one, God has a sovereign will and God has a permissive will. We're going to begin with the sovereign will of God. What this is this is the part of the things that God desires. This is the desire of God that he sees to take place that cannot be changed regardless of what happens, regardless of man, regardless of what anyone wants or what anyone desires or what anyone chooses. Nobody can change the sovereign will of God. As you read the Bible, you can begin to see some of these things take place. This does not mean that man does not have choice. This means that regardless of what man chooses, he still can't stop God's will from taking place. And in fact, there's a lot of people who will tell you today that man just don't have a choice in the matter, and really that's degrading to God. God is so great and so far above us that he can allow mankind to have complete free will, and we still can't stop God's plan from happening. That's amazing. And there's a lot of people who desire to do that. Let me give you and I mentioned some of this maybe a little while back on a Sunday morning, if my memory serves me right. Y'all remember Joseph in the Bible? And Joseph had dreams concerning his brethren and his mother and his father, and he saw them in his dreams bowing down to him. Y'all remember this? And that made his brothers feel really good, and they were really proud that they were going to bow to their younger brother. Isn't that right? No, they were extremely upset. They did not want it to happen. They meant it was not going to happen. And so there came a time where he went to see them. And I can't remember the city right off the top of my head. They were supposed to be tending the sheep, but they were not tending the sheep. They were off in the city carousing and partying and doing that kind of thing. And Joseph came to see them. And they said, okay, here comes the dreamer. Let's do something with him. Let's kill him. That's what we'll do. We'll kill him. Well, Reuben decides and persuades them, no, let's don't kill him. That's not. But let's put him in a pit. We'll teach him a lesson. We'll put him in a pit. And so they put him in a pit. And his brothers come and they sell him. And they sell him into slavery to the Ishmaelites. And they sell him into, which is eventually he goes down into Egypt and he becomes a Potiphar, a servant for Potiphar. And the idea, the sentiment, when you go back and you read that account of what took place, his brothers were essentially saying, this fella's we're not going to bow to him. We will not bow to him. We'll kill him. We'll put him in a pit. We'll sell him to Egypt. We will not bow. How now? We've sold him. Look what we've done. We've sold him into slavery. Let's see us bow to him now. And the very thing that they did to keep themselves from bowing and to stop God's will from happening was the very thing that caused it to take place. Same thing happened with Christ. We'll not have this man to reign over us. Crucify him. And as they mocked him on the cross at Calvary, that's what they were saying. That's what they were mocking about. Let's see you be king now. They mocked him and gave him a crown of thorns. And they gave him a reed for a scepter in mocking. And then they took the reed from him and beat him in the head, beat those thorns into his head, spit in his face. They mocked him. Let's come off the cross if you're Christ. If you're the king of Israel, if you are the Messiah, come off the cross. Let's see you reign over us now. The very thing they did to stop God's will is the very thing that put Christ in place to reign over them for all eternity. Ezekiel speaks of a time, this is throughout the book in different parts of the book of Ezekiel, that he saw the glory of God come out of the temple, go over Jerusalem, over to the Mount of Olives, and eventually ascend into heaven. And he describes one day about seeing the glory of God return, come down to the Mount of Olives, and he come through the gate, the golden gate, or the beautiful gate, the eastern gate. You know, a lot of people talk about the eastern gate. And he would come back into Jerusalem. You know what they've done to the eastern gate? They blocked it up. You know why they blocked it up? To stop Jesus from coming through it one day. You think them blocks is going to keep Jesus from coming through the eastern gate? Man cannot stop the will of God, his sovereign will. Man cannot stop the Antichrist from coming. Man cannot stop the tribulation from coming. Man cannot stop Jesus from coming in the clouds and rapturing his saints one day. Man cannot stop the sovereign will of God. And so as we're reading the Bible and you read this thing, you ask yourselves, is this belong in the sovereign will of God, or does this belong in the permissive will of God? Can it be stopped? Often you'll find your answer there in the context of it. Romans chapter 3, real quick. I'm going to give you a couple of verses, another couple of examples about the sovereign will of God. Romans chapter 3. Here Paul is describing some things between the Jews and the Gentiles, and with Jesus being the Christ, that Paul's anticipating these questions, and Jesus being the Christ and salvation then being only through Christ. And the question obviously would arise that what advantage was there to be a Jew anyway, Really the answer to that question is kind of the same thing that I like to think about from our perspective. That if you desired your children to be saved, would you raise them in church or out of it? And obviously you would raise them in church, trying to understand and learn and grow up knowing something of who God is. Well, that's the case with Israel, and that's what he's saying, that in every way, chiefly because unto them were committed the oracles of God. They had the law, they had these things that they knew about God. They were raised with somewhat of an understanding of the person of God, although maybe many of them did not know him in a spiritual relationship because they had not trusted Jesus Christ. And so he's showing them the difference there. But he comes to this question in verse 3, which is a rhetorical question, but he answers it anyway. He says, what if some did not believe? What if there were some of the Jews that did not believe? What if there were some of the Jews that did not believe that Jesus was the Christ, did not believe that what all God was going to do? What if they did not believe in the plan of God? He says, shall their unbelief make the faith or the faithfulness of God without effect? In other words, that if they don't believe, is that going to stop God from doing what he said he's going to do? Well, what's the next two words in verse 4? God forbid. They're not going to stop God from doing what he set out to accomplish. They're not going to stop God from accomplishing salvation if they believe or if they don't believe. What does that mean today? That means if you don't believe that Jesus is the Christ, that doesn't mean you're going to stop Christ from coming. It just simply means you're going to go to hell when he does. Jesus is the Christ. It's like the man made the statement one day, an old preacher said, what you need to do is you need to put God first. Or a young preacher said that, actually. Young preacher preached the message, said you need to put God first. And the older preacher got him outside. He said, just a little bit of counsel on that. He said, you don't ever need to put God first. He said, God's already first. You just need to recognize it. That's the point. We often say that, but God's first whether we see him that way or not. God is the priority whether we see him that way or not. So there are certain things that in God's will that will not be stopped. And then there are what we call the permissive will of God. There are some things that can be changed. There are some things that God will, while he desires for one thing to happen, he will permit something else to happen. He will allow it to be the case. God never intended in sin in the beginning. Sin is never intended by God. In other words, God could have accomplished in his will and his purpose is to dwell with mankind and to have many sons and many daughters. And he could have done that through Adam in the Garden of Eden if sin would have never came into the world. And man had choice. God permitted sin. He allowed it. And the reason that God allowed sin, even knowing what would take place, the reason God allowed sin is to bring even more sons and daughters through the Lord Jesus Christ. Through the glory of Christ. Let's go a little bit further in the idea of just turn to Luke 22. Luke 22. I want to read one to you. Luke chapter 22, very familiar account here. I know you're all probably very familiar with this. This is not the place, and you talk about the permissive will of God, this is not the place where we have a choice, but this is a place where our choice makes a difference. We can actually affect the will of God. I can choose to be in God's will in my life, or I can choose not to. And God will permit me to be out of his will. God will permit me to get out of his will and out of place with him. God will allow that to happen. So let me show that to you biblically. All right? So in Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 30, the disciples here, and Jesus is talking with his disciples, and they're having an argument about which one is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This is not the first time. This is not the only time. This happened a lot, apparently, between the disciples. And it's still a thing that goes on today, that people are still arguing about which one's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I've been guilty of it myself and not even recognizing it. The idea that you want to be the best preacher. I wanted to be that for a while, be the best preacher. I wanted to be the best one ever. And the Lord helped me see, let me just get it. I said, okay, if I'm going to be, after I fought that battle for a while and lost it, then I said, okay, if I'm going to be the best, then I've got to be the least. So I tried to be the least so that I could be the best, and I lost that battle too. And so what do I do next? I said, well, I'm just going to forget all of it. I'm going to do what God's asked me to do, and I'm going to let him take care of the rest of it. That's all I know to do. And that's what he's pointing to anyway. It shouldn't even be a desire for us. It shouldn't even be something that comes in our mind. Just do what God's asked you to do. And be in submission. Be willing to submit and be low and humble before God. That's what he's telling you to do. I feel like that argument was probably one that Peter won a lot of the time, at least in his own mind, because we can see that in Peter. He was always the one that seemed to be speaking. Maybe he was the spokesman for the group, I don't know. But he was always the one that was there. He was always the one that was talking. He was always the example. And then Jesus made this statement here in verse 31 concerning the time that he would deny Jesus, that he ever knew Christ 3 times. Verse 31, and the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. What's the point? Obviously that Jesus was allowing, he was going to allow Satan to test and to tempt Peter with this. He was going to allow Peter to be tempted. He was going to put him on the plate, put him in a place where his life was on the line. Put him in a place where if he said he knew Jesus, he could very possibly be killed for knowing Christ. That's the situation that Peter's being put in. And Jesus is allowing it to happen. The point of this is to notice that Jesus says, Satan has desired to have you. He's allowing it to happen. Verse 32, but I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. Jesus' desire for Peter in this temptation was that he would not fail. That was God's will. That he would not fail. He would not deny Christ. That was the will of God concerning Peter. The question is, did Peter fail or not? Absolutely, he failed, and God allowed him to fail, and he was converted through that failure. He could have been converted without the failure. If he would have chosen not to fail. But he made the decision. He failed. And God allowed him. God permitted it to happen. God will permit us to fail as well. He will permit us to not do certain things. God will permit us to sin. He will permit us to, when he leads us one specific way, he'll permit us to go another. He allowed Jonah. And yet he jerked that string back, jerked that rope back after a little while, and he brought back Jonah to a place where he was submissive again unto the will of God, but God let him go to Tarshish. God will let us go to Tarshish as well. God will put us in a place and ask us to do something. By the way, the will of God is not always pretty. Go to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. The will of God in our lives is not always fun. It's not always pretty. I know that you know these verses as well. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Why is that important? Let us lay aside every weight and the sin that doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. In other words, there's a race that is set before each of us. There is a will that God has for each one of us. And we're to seek God, we're to know that will, and we're to do that will, and we're to run with patience that race. And that race is not the same. He didn't expect all of us to die on the cross. Y'all remember in John, I think it's John chapter 21, right off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure it's John 21, when Jesus was telling Peter about how he was going to die. And one day that you'll be bound hand and foot, this is my own words, you're going to be bound and they're going to take you to a place you don't want to go. That's what Jesus was telling Peter. And John then wrote and said that Jesus was telling Peter about the way he was going to die. And the next thing that Peter did was he pointed at John, and that's what kind of the way I see it. He looked at John and he said, "What would thou have this disciple to do?" And Jesus said, "What if it's my will that he tarry till I come? What does that have to do with you?" In my own words. In other words, that the will that he had for John, it might be completely different than what he had for Peter. And that didn't matter. God still expected Peter to do what he had will to do for Peter. God has a will for us, and it may be different. The will that God has for me may be different than the will that God has for you. I'm certainly that God doesn't call everybody to preach. And so notice this part, back again in Hebrews 12, that he says that in this race, what we're to do is we're to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Why is it that we believe the work of God always got to be fun? Sometimes the Lord's work's not fun. It's hard. It's labor. It's work. It's a labor of love. We talk about missions. We call ourselves missionaries, and we're supposed to be. And then we ask, what's a good mission field? Where's a good place for us to begin in this mission work? If we're going to be a good missionary, we're going to do what God's asked us to do. Where's a good mission field? Start at Dollar General. That's a good place to begin. It is God's will for this church to be a light in this community and lead these people to the Lord that are around us. In fact, that is such the will of God that he told Ephesus if they didn't do it in Ephesus, he would remove the candlestick from them. And they were the only church that was threatened. If you want to find some good work to do for the Lord, turn to these people in this community and be a blessing to them. It's not about just going to tell people about Jesus. It's about trying to find people in our community to be a blessing to. And I want to tell you something. If you can do mission work in South Mississippi, you can do it anywhere in the world. That's a good training ground. Good training ground. We always get to the place where we want to formulate everything. We want to put everything in a box and say, well, you need to do this and this and this and this and this. You can't do that with the Lord, because it's the Lord that grows the church. It's the Lord that gives the increase. It's the Lord that blesses. It's the Lord that's going to bring things. It's the Lord that's going to work out. I could be the pastor that don't misunderstand me. This has crossed my mind, but I could be the pastor that lays everything out and says, okay, we're going to study this and this and this and this, and we're going to do it systematically. That's my nature. I'm going to put it together logically, and we're going to go through just like this. But I can't do that. Because if I put every bit of that together and stand up and preach every bit of it and God's not in it, I hadn't accomplished one thing. Today we have to have God, and we've got to do things God's way. The work of the church, the will of God in our lives is compared to the cross of Christ. That's not fun. It's to be endured with joy in front of us when we get done. It's not always going to be fun. It's not going to be a bed of roses, but we're to take up our cross and follow Christ. And that's our cross, the will of God. There are things we'll find when you begin to serve God. Most everything that God asks you to do in His will for you is something you don't want to do. Most every time. And it's something that you have fought and you have done. I did everything I could do for the Lord but preach. But today, let me ask you this. Let me get back to the will. When you look at the permissive will of God and the will of God for your life, which is, kind of the biggest idea and discussion about the will of God, do y'all ever have place and time in life where it's hard to see God's will? And from small things, decisions where you're trying to make financial decisions, maybe move or build a house or buy a car or something of the nature, financial decisions, even up to things about where you need to be, what you need to be doing for the Lord's work, all of these things. Y'all ever find it where it's hard to know exactly? You will never see past your own desire. You will never see past. I'm going to say this clearly. If you can't see God's will in your life, it's because you're desiring something that God don't want for you, and you won't let it go. Let me tell you how I know that. Number one, I know it by experience. But the greatest and most important, I know it biblically. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies, that is your will, your bodies, a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. You submit your will to His will. By the way, you know why? Now this is what's interesting. One of the reasons, at least, is the reason I did it. You know why you might choose your will over God's will? Is because you think you can provide more joy for yourself in your plan for your life than what God can give you. That's pride. I was so prideful that I thought I could have more joy and more peace and more hope out of life by doing it my own way. I said, if I surrender to preach, my life is over. I will never enjoy it. There's no joy in being a preacher. It's almost humorous. But I surrendered to preach, and I preached for a while, and I said, how can I have this much fulfillment and joy? Today we've gotten arrogant. We've gotten to the place where we think if we can get a certain job and a certain amount of money, and we put everything up, and we get all of this stuff, and we get everything just like we want it in this American dream, that somehow it's going to bring joy and peace and hope. And it ain't going to do it. God's the only way that's going to happen. So today, let go of your desires and set your eyes on the will of God. Because you can walk out of His will and He'll let you. But today you can be in His will and you can find joy and peace and hope. All of the other fruit of the Spirit as well. Today you'll let go of your will. God has a will. And there's some things about the will of God that we will not stop. And that's the sovereign will of God. But there are a lot of things about the will of God that is permissible. And God will permit us to walk away. And God will permit us to do things. God will permit you today to go to hell. If you're lost here today and you've never trusted the Lord Jesus Christ, it is not God's will that you stay there. God is not willing that any would perish. God is not willing that any would perish. He does not want you to stay lost. He wants you to be saved. But that is your choice. He will permit you to die and go to hell. He'll allow that to happen. Because He's given you the option. And He's not going to take that option away from you. He's going to allow you to choose what you would have. Will you trust Christ or will you not? Will you spend eternity in heaven or will you spend eternity in the lake of fire? That's your choice. God's will is that you not perish. While we have a verse of a song.